Hello everyone, and welcome to another geostatistics tutorial video. And in this video, I want to begin our discussion on point distributions. And I want to talk about sort of the general categories. I'm going to go over 5 of them that you're most likely to see in various data sets in the real world. And I want to go through and give a couple of examples of where or what sort of trends might generate something that looks like that. So let's go ahead and let's talk about the first sort of distribution. And I'm going to make these in a nice big, make the points kind of big, and we're going to use red. So the first distribution is going to look something like this. I apologize if my artistic rendering is impeding the process here. But what I'm going for, hopefully you'll see, is a series of evenly spaced points across the image. And that last row got a little bit away from me there. But the idea here, right, is that this is what's called a uniform regular distribution. A uniform regular distribution. And what this means is that basically you have a uniform coverage of the area in a regular pattern. And so, again, these points are evenly spaced apart. They cover the entire area in a regular pattern. And so some examples you might see of this, the biggest one from a GIS perspective, right? You're going to get this anytime you do a point to raster. Or sorry, raster to point, I should say. Right, so if you took something like an elevation raster, and you converted it to point data, right, you would get this uniform regular distribution. Another good example, I'm going to scroll down and give us just a little bit more room here. Right. Another good example might, in sort of a real world setting, might be a tree farm, where you have the agricultural people responsible for the tree farm going through and intentionally setting up this regular pattern of trees to maximize their growth and ease of harvest, right? So this is sort of a GIS specific example, and you're going to see this all the time. And then a real world example would be something like a tree farm. So let's scroll up just a little bit, and let's talk about our second pattern type, which is going to be hopefully I get this across here. It's supposed to look a little messy. Right, so this right here, this is called a uniform irregular distribution. So a uniform irregular, right? Again, you get that uniform coverage. Of the area. But in an irregular pattern. Right, so we're still covering the whole area in points, but there's no, they're not evenly spaced like they were in uniform regular. Right, so a good example of this would actually be a forest. Right, a naturally occurring forest. If you were to take an image of a forest and you were to put a dot on every single tree, you would see a uniform, assuming that you that the whole image was a forest or the whole area was a forest, right? You would see this uniform irregular pattern, most likely. And again, this ties into scale, which we're going to talk about either at the end of this video or at the next video. But again, right, uniform irregular, you have uniform coverage, but there isn't the same pattern that there was in uniform regular. Okay, so let's talk about maybe some patterns that aren't uniform. And the first one we're going to talk about looks something like this. Right, this pattern here where you have a lot of points in one side of the area and it sort of tapers down in frequency in another. Right, this is called a non-uniform gradient. Right, a non-uniform gradient. And so a non-uniform gradient, basically the frequency of the points increases as you go in one direction. Right? And so it's important to note here that what I've drawn here, right, is a right to left gradient, right? You increase as you go from right to left. But there's nothing special specifically about right to left, right? This could have been left to right, where the majority of points were over here. This could have been, bottom to top, where most of the points were up here. It could even have been, lower left to upper right, where most of the points were up here. The idea with a non-uniform gradient, though, is that you have a lower frequency of points in one part of the image, and that increases as you go in one direction. Okay. And so a good example of this might be trees in an ecotone. Right? And if you don't know what an ecotone is, right, an ecotone is that boundary between two ecosystems. So if you had, say, a prairie ecosystem bordering a forest ecosystem, right, that ecotone, if your image or if your data set or your area was along that boundary between a forest and a prairie or a field, right, you might see this non-uniform gradient if these points were tree crowns, where you'd have a lot of tree crowns in the area closer to the forest, but maybe not as many in the area that was closer to the field. Right. And so again, we're going to talk about the idea of scale and location in probably in the next video. But again, non-uniform gradient basically is just saying that there is a lot of points in one part of the image and it sort of gradually tapers down as you move away from it. And it's usually in one direction. All right, so let's talk about two other types of non-uniform gradients, and they're similar, but not identical. So the first, we have something that looks like this, and I'm drawing sort of the most extreme example I can think of here. Right. This is a non-uniform clustered. Right? So a non-uniform clustered basically means the presence of one point right? This increases the likelihood of the presence of another point nearby. Right. And so sort of the classic example of a non-uniform cluster would be, contagious diseases. Right. Contagious disease is probably the number one example of non-uniform clustered, because when you have one person who gets sick, the frequency of having other people getting sick in the nearby area increases, and that sort of decreases the farther away you get from that patient zero. Right, so contagious disease is sort of the classical example of this non-uniform clustered. So the next example is similar. Right, but this is what's called non-uniform dispersed. Right, and non-uniform dispersed is basically the presence of one point. Right, the presence of one point decreases the likelihood of the presence of a point nearby. Of a point nearby, right? So a good example of this would be large cities. Right? If you think about large cities like Detroit, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, right? Large cities are a great example of a non-uniform dispersed distribution, because you can imagine, right, if you have a large city like, say, Chicago, right, all of the resources that are present in Chicago make it less likely that another big city is going to sprout up nearby, because they wouldn't be able to have the resources necessary to compete, right? Everybody's just, oh, right, we can get that in Chicago, right? If we're in the suburbs of Chicago, we don't need another big city, right? We have Chicago. So that's a good example of non-uniform dispersed. Another good example of non-uniform dispersed would be what's called allelopathy. And I'm sorry if I butchered the spelling of allelopathy, but allelopathy is something that you see in ecology, where you have specific types of organisms that alter their environment to make it less suitable for more of that type of organism to exist in that area. So a good example of this would be a specific species of plants that once they've established themselves, right, they produce chemicals into the soil that make it less likely for other species to be able to take hold in that area. And it sort of spreads out that species in space. So you have one individual making it harder for other individuals to come close. So that's again an example where you have the presence of one individual point making it less likely for there to be another point nearby. So I know there was a lot of information here, but these 5-point distributions are probably the most common that you're going to see, and we're going to come across different ways to test for these different distributions. So hopefully this made sense. As always, if something didn't, I encourage you to go back, rewatch the part you're confused about, and as always, please reach out. Thank you.